If fact is stranger than fiction, then this top 10 list is going to be stranger than my previous book list. When I initially set out to create a top 10 book list, I was going to put my fiction and nonfiction books together within that list, but then I realized two things. First of all, when I'm ranking them from 1 to 10, how do you match up a nonfiction book against a work of fiction? They're just so very different, it's hard to know how I would rank that. And then secondly, I realized I would have to leave out too many really excellent books, so I decided to split them up into two lists and thus get 20 books in total. So let's dive into my nonfiction list with number 10, a book that was originally published in 1837 called The Pirate's Own Book, Authentic Narratives of the Most Celebrated Sea Robbers by the Marine Research Society. There's something really neat about reading a book that was written during the time period that it's talking about. So this is kind of just after, I guess, the golden age of piracy, and it's talking about the events that happened not long after they happened. Here's the thing that's a bummer about the book, though. We have this sort of romanticized view of pirates. They're all over pop culture. They're fun, exciting, funny, and highly entertaining. But the problem is, when you read what they were actually like, they were the worst. They're just horrible people. It was actually kind of hard to eventually get through this book because of how awful it was. But at the end of the day, the fact that I found it so interesting sort of outweighed that and got it to number 10 on my list. Now for number 9, which is Generals Die in Bed, a story from the trenches by Charles Yale Harrison. This is an autobiographical account from a soldier during the First World War. Now just to dive in for a second to my own history with this type of book, back when I was a kid I recall two sort of styles of books that I was really into. One was detective novels, so I read all the Hardy Boys books and I read all of the Sherlock Holmes stories. And then the other was autobiographies and biographies of First and Second World War pilots. I was especially fascinated by the fighter pilots and their accounts of the action and adventure of being a pilot during those world wars. Now in the First World War, the pilots became known as the Knights of the Sky. The whole concept of aviation was such a new thing, let alone military aviation. And so these pilots were seen as daring adventurers, pioneers, and just dashing figures in general. They even had traits of the medieval chivalry where if an opponent ran out of ammunition, maybe they would just let them go and fly away rather than shoot down a helpless opponent. And so it really glorified these particular combatants. And once I had read through pretty much everything I could find on those topics, I sort of started to dive more into the infantry soldiers' points of view, such as with this particular book. And in doing so, I discovered, I think, what war was really about, what it was like for most people who participated in it, and also learned lessons about war from the people who were there. So Generals Die in Bed is kind of a rare look at the First World War from the perspective of the trenches, and it's a harsh and brutal book, but at the same time I think it's an important book. Alright, let's move on to number 8, which is Gang Leader for a Day by Sudhir Venkatesh. One topic that I never get tired of reading about is humans in extreme situations, and so that's partly why I enjoy those war autobiographies so much. But I've also read books like John Krakauer's Into Thin Air about an Everest expedition. And this is kind of a crazy story. This young writer decided that he wanted to learn more about street gangs in Chicago. So what he did one day was he walked into a high-rise that was the known turf of one of the notorious Chicago street gangs and decided he wanted to just define them and talk to them. And right off the bat, he was very nearly murdered by these guys who were like, "What the heck are you doing here?" But over time, he really got the trust of the gang, got to know them, got to sort of be a part of their world for a while, and he just wrote this book, which is a really interesting book too. I keep using that word interesting, but it's true with a lot of these nonfiction books. Anyhow, moving on to a more light-hearted topic with death. Number 7 is Tuesdays with Morrie by Mitch Albom. I mentioned in my previous list the fact that so many of these books I haven't read in years and years, and I really have no idea what I'd think about them now when I read them. And this is one of those situations where I haven't actually read this book in maybe 20 years, I don't know, but I recall it saying very interesting things about life and death, which as a paramedic and as someone who suffered from serious illnesses and almost died a couple of times, these are topics that are pretty important to me. So I don't know what I'd think about the book if I reread it, but I have a fond enough memory of it to have it at number 7 in my list. Moving on to number 6, and I've just noted that a book about SEAL Team 6 is my number 6. For some reason I didn't notice that before, but this is Rogue Warrior by Richard Marcinko. It is the explosive autobiography of the controversial, death-defying founder of the US Navy's top-secret counter-terrorist unit, SEAL Team 6. This is a military book that sort of goes back to that dashing adventure type of style that I was talking about with the aviators. And the author has written a lot of fiction as well, and you sort of wonder how true all of the stuff in this book is. Even if some things are embellished, it's quite the wild story. And now we'll go on to something that really is an actually light-hearted book with number 5, called S.H.T. My Dad Says by Justin Halpern. This is a very small, very light read. You could easily blast it out in an evening, and it's just purely hilarious. The reason it's in my top 5 is because it's so funny and so well written and just had me laughing out loud. There's not really much else to say about it, other than it made me happy. So, on to number 4, which is another contemporary chronicle. It is a lovely folio edition. Oops, going the wrong way with this. And it is called Contemporary Chronicles of the 100 Years' War. This is going back even 500 years prior to that pirate book I was just showing you, all the way back to the 14th century in medieval England and France. And it covers the writings of 3 contemporary authors who lived during that time, named Jean le Bel, Enguerrand de Monstrelet, and the more famous Jean Froissart. There's just something so cool about reading the writing of people who lived during the Middle Ages and wrote about their life and their experiences. And there's so many wild, fascinating stories that are told about the knights of that time. Again, I'm sure there's a lot of embellished stuff in there, but even so, the stories that are told are really just pretty wild and amazing. I'm not quite sure why I'm showing you this blank cover, but as somebody who's really interested in history, this was really an amazing read for me. And now into the top 3, and number 3 is another book that is sticking with history. It is called The Forgotten Soldier by Guy Saget. Just as Generals Die in Bed was an account of an infantryman during the First World War, this is the autobiography of an infantryman during the Second World War. In fact, the author was a native Frenchman who ended up fighting in the German army, and he was fighting on probably the worst front of the war, which is the East Front in the war against Russia. I've heard it said that this is the truest account of what it was like to be a soldier during the Second World War. It certainly holds back nothing of the horror and tragedy of that role. It's not an easy read, but it's a very important read, and the author does have a lot of things to say about humanity and war that are very worth reading. There are a number of other books of this genre that I've read, such as Soldier X by Don Wolfson, The Medic by Leo Litwack, and A Rumor of War by Philip Caputo, and then Farley Mowat's books, And No Bird Sang and My Mother's Son. Incidentally, when I was a kid, I did enjoy a lot of Farley Mowat's fictional writing about the animals and whatnot. But anyhow, The Forgotten Soldier wins out over those books just for the truly important things it has to say. And now, number 2 is a very unique book, although it's somewhat along the line of Gang Leader for a Day, to be honest with you. This one is called Down to This, Squalor and Splendor in a Big City Shantytown by Shaughnessy Bishop Stall. Now, the story behind this book is the author was at a really rough spot in his life. I think he had just broken up with a longtime girlfriend. His job wasn't going well. Things were just not going well at all in his life. And he decided that what he would do is he would basically get rid of everything. He would dive fully into the drugs he was dabbling with, and he would actually move into a homeless community in Toronto. He lived as a drug-addicted and homeless person for a year, and he wrote about his experiences within that community. This gives a truly amazing perspective to a group of people who are so marginalized and looked down upon, and it really gives them some humanity and really quite an important perspective on the situation that these folks are facing. It was really an amazing read. As with Gang Leader for a Day, the author just completely immersed himself within this culture and thus was able to write 100% honestly about it. Okay, for my number one work of fiction of all time, I have to bring down my Kurt Vonnegut mug. And I have to say that rather than an individual book, my number one is going to be more of a general series of books, and that is the nonfiction writings of Kurt Vonnegut Jr. So the two examples that I'm fortunate enough to own here are Fate's Worse Than Death and Wampeters, Foma, and Granfalloons. These are collections of Kurt Vonnegut's essays, speeches, and various nonfiction writings, and I just like them so much better than Vonnegut's fiction. They tend to cover the same important issues that are discussed in Vonnegut's fiction, but the difference is within the fiction, all the lessons are told as allegory and through story, whereas the nonfiction books tell sort of the same lessons, but in a very straightforward manner. Kurt Vonnegut's writing is obviously very simple, very direct and to the point, and really makes it feel like he's just sitting there having a chat with you. But despite the language being so simple, the topics he covers are extremely important. They share the wisdom of somebody who's lived a long life and has learned a lot of vital things about humanity and about life itself. When my kids are old enough, I'm going to have them read these books because I think they are that important. The problem is they're damn hard to find in the used bookstores. There are a couple of other titles that I've read that I had borrowed from other people that I'm trying to get hold of. One is Palm Sunday, another is A Man Without a Country, and they're both the same style of books as these, which are just collections of essays and speeches. And they're all just so full of this wisdom that I can't recommend them highly enough. So I'm curious to know what nonfiction books you recommend. If there's anything you think I should check out, let me know in the comments below. Thanks. Hey, it's Josh. Thank you so much for watching my video. If you could consider doing one of the following things, I would appreciate it. Give me a thumb up, subscribe to my channel. If you've already subscribed, hit that notification bell, or share the link to the video with somebody who you think would enjoy it. Oh, I can't see either of those. Hey-o. When I initially set out to create a top 10 book list, I initially was going to put, I said initially twice. There's something really neat about the fact that this book was written. There's something really neat about a book being written. There's something really neat about a book being written. There's something really neat about a book being written during the contemporary period about which a story from the this is an autobiographies and biography, but it's still a really fascinating read and quite an adventurous romp, really, and quite a thrilling ride. It's quite a story, even if it's not 100%. Just as Generals Die in Bed was an account of an infantryman. Just as Generals Die in Bed was an account of an infantryman. Just as Generals Die in Bed was an. Oh my goodness.